To understand why the first millennium was so full of heresies and schisms, I think we have to understand what Christianity was first and foremost. And before Christianity was even called Christianity, it was simply called the Way. This is incredibly significant. It shows that the Christian church was not primarily about the organization of the structure. It was about a path to following Christ. It was about a life, a living relationship with Christ as God himself provided. As Christ promised, the Holy Spirit founded and the apostles led. It was primarily a way of life. Because of that, due to human sinfulness and pride, there are those who begin to dogmatize their particular opinions about this way of life. And when that happens, when something is inconsistent with the life of the church, the faithful necessarily have to begin setting up boundaries. Why? Well, because if Christianity is primarily a way of sanctification, if it's a way towards God, then bad doctrine equals bad medicine. And bad medicine means we're not going to end up in the same path. It's going to lead you astray. You're going to end up somewhere else other than what the intended destination, which is union with Christ. So anytime a different opinion would arise, if it became seen as authoritative by anyone, the church fathers would rise up and say, we need to now put into words what our experience of this life actually is. And at times in the history of the church, some of those movements became so vast that even after they were condemned, people continued to adhere to them, claiming that they were the true path. And over time, of course, this is just repeated again and again. Now, in a way, there's actually some benefit to this. And the benefit is that if this weren't the case, Christians would not have explained their beliefs. They would not have put into words as much as has been put into words. But of course, the bad part of this is that without true discernment, which comes over a great deal of time and asceticism and love for Christ, humility, with a great deal of wisdom, without true discernment, people are continually led astray and they follow false paths. And some of those false paths look very similar from the outside, but you find inwardly they're not. And some of them are just open rejections of what the church has always believed.
Often a misconception that the ecumenical councils, when all the bishops got together, that was the time that they would invent doctrines of the church. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this is a very common view and I see it often people write this simply for simplicity's sake, but they don't realize that what they're doing is they're actually purveying a big misconception, dangerous misconception, I think, when they say that an ecumenical synod decided such and such. They decided that Jesus Christ is fully God and fully human. They decided that the Son is co-eternal and of the same essence as the Father. They decided the Holy Spirit is of the same essence. No, the church doesn't decide these things. These things are just true, and God reveals them to the church, and these things are known within the church, even if, again, not written out fully, because to put in human finite language what is divine and infinite is impossible, so the church is always reluctant. The church says, no, go live it, and you'll know, because it's God revealed. The ecumenical councils, therefore, didn't decide what the church believed, but rather they put into writing what before had always been believed at the heart of the faith. And they put into writing in the best words possible. And what I mean by that is that because human language is finite and it's human, it can't describe what is divine and infinite, and therefore they give the best estimation or the best possible language for what it is. Father John Romanides, a theologian of the 20th century, he says that we need to understand that in heaven we will transcend the creed, the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed. There's no more need for it because it's lived. We know it by experience, and the words are too limiting. The words are very, very limiting to actually explain the vastness and beauty of this mystery. But when heresy arises, the ecumenical councils come along and say, okay, we need to delineate these things for two reasons. Number one, we need to set up boundaries so that people remain on the straight and narrow path and they don't veer off into these dangerous areas where, again, bad medicine will lead to bad results. But secondly, I like this image more, on the platform of true mysteries, we dive into the true mystery of God. But if we have the false platforms, we have the false mystery of God, which means we're diving into a poisoned lake, essentially. And so the doctrines aren't meant merely to constrain the way that we think. They're actually meant to lead us to the true mystery and lead us to true freedom and the true vastness of God's existence, to make sure that we are entering God in the proper way, entering his life and being infused with his life and finding union with him in the proper way.
So maybe fast forwarding a little bit, we start seeing issues. Maybe we could talk a little bit about like some of the issues that we start seeing between East and West. Prior to the schism, we start seeing that there's issues with, even just traditions of beards, azymes, using unleavened versus leavened bread. Maybe talk about some of those issues that start to boil and get worse over time.
Mm-hmm. So in the Roman Empire, we often talk about the Roman versus the Byzantine Empire. This is a misnomer. This is an invention of historians. And so again, where language can cause a lot of issues. There was simply the Roman Empire, but to complicate that a bit, there was the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, and there was separation there. Not complete division; they were seen as united, but there was separation there. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the culture and language was primarily Greek. In the Western, it was primarily Latin. And so because of that, there were times, and due to historical reasons, anomalies, there's really a lot that goes into this, there began to be less and less communication between East and West. And so traditions began to occur in the West and grow and become normalized that had not in the East. And over time, when really during the time of St. Photius, in the I believe in the 8th century, when missionaries were being sent to the north, they were being sent both from Rome and from Constantinople. The missionaries ended up contacting one another and realizing, my goodness, we look very different and we have some different beliefs about things, and some of these things began to come to a head. With time, some of this they sought to resolve at the time of St. Photius. In fact, there were a few different councils that dealt largely with the person of St. Photius, but also with some of the theology that was being objected to, especially the filioque. And there was a very small council that deposed St. Photius, and then there was a much larger council that said that he was the true patriarch, that Rome could not interfere in the dealings of another church, and that the filioque was not to be added to the creed. And that was actually seen for some time as the 8th ecumenical synod. Eventually in the West, from what I understand, it was papal lawyers who hundreds of years later saw this and said, you know what, that's no longer the 8th ecumenical council. The council before that is the 8th one, the one that deposed St. Photius. So there's a lot of confusion there. There's a great article on this. I don't remember the exact name of it, but it's by Dr. David Ford on the filioque and what's often called the Phocian schism. I would really recommend that article. But at that time, there were a lot of attempts at reconciliation with some of these issues, but they really didn't get fully resolved. And over time, by the time 1054, which is the traditional date of the Great Schism, as that date comes along, these issues had been embedded now for well over 200 years. Even the Great Schism at the time was not seen as a permanent division between the two, as if there's now Orthodox Christianity in the East and Roman Catholicism in the West. It was seen mainly as a temporary schism up until the what's traditionally considered the Fourth Crusade came and Constantinople was sacked, and that seemed to put a final seal on this division.
Maybe for people that aren't familiar with the term filioque, what is the filioque, and was it equally a problem because of its addition to the creed as it was a theological issue, or what happened there?
Sure. So the filioque comes from the Latin word filioque, which means and the Son. So in the creed, as the fathers of the first and second ecumenical synods composed it, the theology stated that we believe in the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father. In the West, they added the word filioque, which means the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, which is exactly what filioque means. St. Maximus the Confessor heard of this, and he immediately assumed that what was being discussed here was not the eternal procession of the Holy Spirit. In other words, not to see, even that language is a little bit sticky, not to see the Son as a cause of the Holy Spirit, but rather to see that the Father is the cause, but the Holy Spirit proceeds through the Son, which is a perfectly acceptable Orthodox view on these things. But in the West, there seemed to be an insistence that no, both the Father and the Son are causes of the Holy Spirit. So two big problems occurred at the time of the Great Schism with this. Number one was the fact that the Pope of Rome was insisting that he had the authority to make this change. That the second, it was really, I think, the fourth or the fifth ecumenical synod, where there was a decision that the creed simply could not be changed. You could not add to, subtract from, or alter it. And this was signed off by Rome, to the point that one of the popes actually put on, I believe it was bronze or maybe silver tablets outside of the cathedral in Rome, the creed without the filioque. So the first big issue was, does the Pope have the authority to do this? When previous popes had said no to this, they had absolutely rejected this. An ecumenical council had not only composed the creed, but another ecumenical council had declared universally, the whole church, that this could not be changed, and that this change was being made without consulting the other patriarchates. And of course, all the other patriarchates said, no, we've never done that. This would be an absolute aberration. 1,000 years into the Christian church, this is an aberration from how things have always been done. Nothing has ever been done like this before. This is completely new. It's not acceptable. So that was issue number one. Issue number two was with the theology of it. And there's a lot of ways to explain the theology. If someone wants to read an account on the Orthodox objection to the filioque, there's two major accounts. The first is on the mystagogy of the Holy Spirit by St. Photius the Great, and the second is by St. Gregory Palamas, and it's called an apodictic treatise on the Holy Spirit. You know, both of these are like really good nightly reading. That'll get you pumped up. You can tell by the titles. So both of these are theological, and they're polemical invectives against the filioque. But there's a lot of interesting arguments in there. For instance, one of the arguments St. Photius makes is he says, is the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father perfect? If it is perfect, then why does the Holy Spirit also need to proceed from the Son? And if it's not perfect, then is this God? It's kind of an interesting argument. He takes this from a lot of different standpoints. The basic way that I would describe the issue of the filioque is this. The Orthodox understanding of the Trinity is that the essence is that which is common to all three persons, or hypostases, of the Trinity. And mainly we could say about that is the uncreatedness of God. The uncreatedness of God, the essence of God, is shared equally by all three members, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Each hypostasis has a characteristic that it alone has that the other two do not share. The main characteristic of the Father is that he is unbegotten. The main characteristic of the Son is that he is begotten of the Father and became incarnate. And the main characteristic of the Holy Spirit is that he proceeds from the Father and that he descended on Pentecost. These things are distinct to each member or person of the Holy Trinity. With the filioque, we get Trinitarian confusion, because now the Father and the Son share being causes of the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is a cause of neither of the other two. And so it throws the Holy Trinity into an imbalance. Now, these things are often seen to be, maybe minor. Maybe people think that this is getting worked up over nothing, but that's a very big discussion. These again, different doctrine creates different results, and whenever you change a side of doctrine, something on worship is going to have to balance out and equal it. So it does have changes. It does make changes, other theological changes. It has implications. But also, there's the bigger question of is what was revealed? Because we believe that true theology is first and foremost revealed by God. And the church, for that reason, is called the pillar and ground of truth. And so once a church, a local church we would say, in this case Rome, begins teaching something dogmatically that is not in line with the revealed truth, especially that which came for 1,000 years before it, then we would say they're no longer, they've separated themselves from that perfect line of apostolic succession. and it can no longer be the true church.
So today, in today's time, the Roman Catholic Church maintains that the filioque is to be understood as through the Son. Was that always the case, or did they kind of change their stance on it?
Yeah, this is something that I will admit, it's been so many years since I've studied that I don't have a good foundation on this anymore. My memory's not that good. But I remember years and years ago when I studied this that it seemed like a lot of the councils in Roman Catholicism on this seemed to be a little bit contradictory. And it could be the way that I was reading them, but I remember at the time finding councils that seemed to directly say that the Son is a cause, an eternal cause of the Holy Spirit. Others say that he's not. So this is something I'm actually doing my own deeper studies on at this time, and I have about 5 different books, 5 or 6. Two or three of them are directly from Orthodox sources. One is seen as more neutral and just looks at both, and then one is directly a Roman Catholic source. And so, God willing, in the next couple of years, I'll do a deeper study of this myself. But I'm certainly no expert in this area.
So St. Photius vehemently opposed the filioque as an addition to the creed, right? And also theologically.
Correct.
He ended up coming back into communion with Rome towards the end of his life, correct? How does he reconcile that he wrote against it and then he came back into it without the Latin Church removing it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reason that St. Photius had no issue going back into communion with Rome is because, as far as he knew, the council that reinstated him and that openly stated the creed would not include the filioque was still the final word on this. And so even though that council, from what I understand, did not theologically condemn the filioque, he believed that the issue was now moot because the Pope at that time had actually signed off on that council, which is, again, another historical, it's a very interesting thing that the Pope at the time signed off on saying that the filioque will not go into the creed, and that Rome will not interfere in the other patriarchates without them asking first. So he had died with the belief that this was now settled, and that there was now peace with this, and that his position had actually won out.
When did the schism happen, and why did it happen? What was the breaking point that said, you know what, we're not?
The year 1054 is typically the date given for the Great Schism, but again, as we've discussed, this is something that was occurring for 200 years beforehand, over 200 years, and continued happening for another couple hundred years after. And then in 1204, at the Fourth Crusade, this is when the final seal on this, what was seen just as a schism at the time, was really made. There were attempts at reunions, but in those attempts, it was discovered that the chasm theologically between East and West was actually quite a bit bigger than people had realized. This happens to this day. I think there are a lot of issues that people look at and they think that when you get down to it, there's really not that big of a difference. But an initial view will lead you to that conclusion. A deeper delving into it, you'll realize, no, actually, there's quite a bit more in the differences, and that chasm has really grown over time. And I think largely the approaches to faith have really changed. But to pinpoint a date for the Great Schism is nearly impossible. It was a process. It was a process that had been happening for hundreds of years before 1054 and continued to happen for another couple hundred years after. The two main issues that are cited are, number one, the authority of the Pope of Rome. Is he, and Pope just means father. They use the word Pope in other patriarchates as well, and including in Alexandria. So the Patriarch of Rome, does he have authority just over Rome, or does he actually have authority over the other patriarchates as well? And of course, in Rome, they said over the entire church. In the East, they said, no, there's no point in listing out 5 patriarchates if we have one over everyone. He wouldn't be on the list. He would be a separate list all of himself. Later on in Vatican I states directly that the Pope is actually above every ecumenical council, that he alone is above which is the coming together of the entire church. So that's a huge shock to the Orthodox. And then the second was his inserting the filioque into the creed, which is not just by his authority, but also the theology of it was objected to in the East.
what I think the term would be primacy of honor, or having,
Sure. Yeah, the common phrase that the Orthodox uses is that the Patriarch of Rome was seen as first among equals. So every bishop is equal. If the papacy is above all the other bishops, then we really don't have a threefold mystery of bishop, priest, and deacon. We have a fourfold of pope, bishop, priest, and deacon, and we don't really see that in the scriptures. We certainly don't see that in the early church. So Rome was certainly given a particular honor. It was seen as a place, as I understand it, in which in disputes in other parts of the church, they could go to Rome for that final say. I will say that I have a personal belief. This is not something I think you'll find in a lot of Orthodox theologians and saints, although maybe it's there, I don't know. But I have a personal belief that there was a special grace granted to Rome because Rome was seen not as above the rest of the church, but rather as the first servant. This is really how the early Christians understood what it meant to be a bishop. And so Rome being first among equals, Rome saw itself as first and foremost a servant of the entire church. And I think that when there was a great humility there, which there was, many of the early popes of Rome are commemorated to this day as saints of the Orthodox Church and very beloved. Two of my favorites, Saint Leo the Great and Saint Gregory the Great, are figures that I have read extensively and have a great veneration and love for. I absolutely love these two figures, and among many other the popes. The Pope of Rome, especially under figures like Saint Gregory, was extremely ascetic. Essentially, lived as a monastic setting, and was a bastion because of the humility. There was a bastion of grace and protection of the church. And it's my personal belief that as that humility waned and suddenly the Pope was now seen as almost lording over the rest of the church, that I think we see a lot of pride beginning to set in with a lot of the papal figures. And I think that's when a lot of that grace and that protecting grace it started to depart. Again, that's my personal view. It's not one that I can say I've taken from any particular source or sources. It's just from my study of history. This is what I believe happened.
So you mentioned that there were attempts at reunification, but whenever they got together, they noticed that the chasm had widened a lot more than they thought. What happened at the Council of Florence, for example? If I'm not mistaken, the West still holds that as an ecumenical council to this day, as an official ecumenical council, but the East does not. The East has rejected this as being a ecumenical.
Yeah, this attempt at reunification, the Council of Ferrara, Florence, it happened in two different places at two different times. I'm certain, by no means am I a church historian, but from what I understand, in these theological talks between East and West, the East was motivated first and foremost for political reasons, for political expediency, because they were being surrounded by various other nations seeking to overtake Constantinople, and they really needed the military might of the West. And so the emperor sent the bishops with the goal of getting a union no matter what. From what I understand, the bishops who went, after much discussion, eventually ceded to the Western view on most issues, except for one, and that was Mark of Ephesus, who is known as a saint of the Orthodox Church. His relics became a source of many miracles, and he's known as one of the three pillars of orthodoxy, along with Saint Gregory Palamas and Saint Photius the Great. And Saint Mark of Ephesus refused to sign the agreement, despite what the emperor wanted, because he said that this would be a betrayal of the Orthodox faith. He's one of the figures who actually went in believing that the differences were not that vast. And then he said that as discussions continued and he studied more, he realized that actually the differences are much greater, and he even has a quote in which he says that at this point, the West is no longer just in schism, now they're just in heresy. He went home and he told the people about the bishops who had signed the agreement and what the agreements were, and the people were completely up in arms. This is one of the cases where the laity are shown to be a protecting force of the church as well. We should all be protectors of the faith, and we should all preserve orthodoxy strongly, as much as we can, always with love. So the people are the ones who revolted against this union, and so the union did not hold because of that.
Is there something to be said there? You know, if the people revolted, because I know in the church, you know, Saint Ignatius talks about, you know, submitting to the bishop and listening to the bishop. At what point can somebody exercise judgment and say, you know what, the bishops have actually gone astray, and, you know, we as the people, the faithful, we need to maintain the orthodoxy of the church?
Sure. For people to object to and even rise up against their bishop, I think there are two perspectives that we need to take. The first is doctrinally. And the doctrinal viewpoint is that when the bishop departs from orthodoxy, he is no longer seen as a true shepherd. It's really as simple as that. If the bishop is no longer in line with the apostles and saints before him, then this bishop is not preserving orthodoxy in the first place. The second perspective, though, is pastoral, and that is a little bit more nuanced, because we see bishops saying and doing things today that we would not consider in line with the faith, and yet we see even great and holy monastics and modern elders and saints not break off communion, but rather advocate for patience and prayer. And so I think we need to be wise about this, and we need to make sure that pastorally we have a great discernment and great wisdom in these areas. It's a dangerous thing to, especially early on in our Orthodox life, to believe that we are a pillar of orthodoxy and that we ourselves have the proper discernment of knowing how to act in these situations. And it takes a great deal of discernment, which comes only after many years of an ascetic life with Christ. And so the best thing to do is find the holy figures in the church and follow them. And until the holy figures I know break communion, I tend to stay with them, and I think that's probably the wisest path. Ultimately, while I do see much that is an absolute scandal and really saddens me in certain areas of the hierarchy, I thank God that we have an incredibly wonderful metropolitan with Syed Saba in the Antiochian Archdiocese right now. But in other places, do I see things that disappoint me and even scandalize me? Yes. At the same time, until something affects this parish, I tell people, focus on yourself and on your own relationship with Christ. And unless there's something that really drives me to make a strong declaration of cutting off communion with a bishop, just preserve your peace. It's really important in this day and age. We need to preserve our peace as much as possible.
Do you think in this stage of how the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church have developed, that reunification is even possible at this point? Or what would need to happen in order for that to become a reality?
Before I say anything about my personal views on what a reunion between East and West would look like, I'll say that I am perfectly acceptable being wrong in this, and knowing that God can work whatever miracles he wants, and God can work things that I believe are otherwise impossible. My personal belief, I think some people might view as a little pessimistic. I don't mean for it to be pessimistic, I just think it's realistic. And my view is that to become Orthodox is not just a matter of agreeing to doctrines. There's a life, there's an ethos, what we call the phronema, that needs to be entered into, and that's something that can't really occur too easily from the top down. It really has to come from the bottom up. I don't see a time in which we will ever be venerating, neither on our side, the Orthodox side, venerating saints that were calling us heretics from the Western side, and I don't see the West, the Roman Catholics, venerating saints from the East who were saying that they were in heresy. I think that this would create too much of a contradiction. So I don't know that unification from the top down is really possible, but I also don't know that it's really practical, because again, to bring even one parish under the Orthodox fold, to just suddenly bestow upon them and say yes, now you're part of the Orthodox Church, it doesn't do the inner work that has to happen. And the Orthodox tend to think in very different ways, and they approach things in very different ways. One priest I know, he said that the difference between the Orthodox and the Protestants is they ask the same questions and come to different conclusions. The Orthodox don't even ask the same questions. And he then said, it's actually more complicated than that. The Orthodox may ask the same question, but they mean completely different things by the same language. So to integrate into that takes a long time, and it's kind of a bottom-up process. And so I don't personally have a lot of hope for the top-down ecumenism. I think the way that it needs to happen is from the bottom up, which means that people need to organically discover the true faith and orthodoxy and then integrate into it.